My name is Samuel Sam Carter. I was a sergeant in the 173rd Airborne Brigade, and I served in Vietnam in 1967. I was just 19 years old when I got shipped out, fresh-faced, full of nerves, and dragging a duffel bag that felt like it weighed more than I did. Looking back, it feels like a lifetime ago, but some of the memories are so vivid they might as well have happened yesterday. The day I landed in Vietnam was hot and sticky. I remember stepping off the plane and being hit with this wall of humid air that smelled like diesel fuel and damp earth. It wasn't like anything I'd ever experienced growing up in Wisconsin. I felt out of place right away, and that feeling didn't leave for a long time. We were stationed near a place called Dak 2 in the Central Highlands. Thick jungle surrounded us, the kind you see in the movies, where every shadow looks like it's hiding something dangerous. The Viet Cong knew the area like the back of their hand, while we were fumbling around like kids lost in the woods. The enemy wasn't just out there somewhere. They were everywhere, and they were watching. My squad was small, just 6 of us. Me, Private Danny Harris, Corporal Joe Ramirez, Specialist Mike Dugan, and our radio man, Private Henry Tex Robinson. Our lieutenant, a guy named Samuels, was fresh out of officer training. He had this clean-cut, by-the-book way about him that didn't always jive with the reality of the jungle. Our main weapon was the M16 rifle. It was light, easy to carry, and could fire 20 rounds in a heartbeat. We carried M26 grenades too, though we were careful not to use them unless we really had to. Ammo was always limited, and resupply wasn't guaranteed. The Viet Cong, on the other hand, had AK-47s, sturdy, simple, and reliable. They didn't jam like our M16s did, which always made me nervous. The first few weeks were mostly patrols. We'd walk for miles, sweating through our fatigues, the straps of our gear digging into our shoulders. Every step felt like it could be your last. The Viet Cong used claymore mines, and they were masters of setting traps. They'd rig up these crude but effective devices that could blow a man's legs clean off. You learned to watch the ground, the trees, and even the air in front of you. Paranoia became a survival skill. One day, about 3 weeks in, we got orders to check out a small village about 10 clicks from our base. Intel said the Viet Cong had been moving supplies through there at night. We loaded up, grabbed our gear, and headed out at dawn. The trek was brutal, the kind of march that makes you curse every decision that brought you there. By the time we got near the village, the sun was starting to go down. We decided to set up a perimeter and wait until morning to move in. That night was eerily quiet. No birds, no bugs, just the occasional rustle of leaves that made you grip your rifle a little tighter. Around midnight, Tex whispered into the radio that he saw movement about 50 yards out. We all froze. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Ramirez and I crawled forward to get a better look. Sure enough, there were shadows moving through the trees, just outside our line of sight. We waited, barely breathing, until they got close enough for us to see them. It was a small group of Viet Cong, maybe 4 or 5 guys, carrying AK-47s and what looked like a crate of supplies. Ramirez looked at me and gave a small nod. We both raised our rifles, but before we could fire, one of them stepped on a branch, snapping it like a gunshot. The rest of our squad heard it too, and within seconds, all hell broke loose. I'll never forget the sound of those first shots. The M16 had this sharp, cracking noise that echoed through the jungle. The AK-47s fired back, their deeper, more guttural bursts filling the air. It was chaos. Shouts, gunfire, the smell of cordite, and the blinding flashes of muzzle fire cutting through the dark. The firefight felt like it lasted hours, though in reality, it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. It was pitch black, the jungle lit only by the quick bursts of muzzle flash and the occasional flare we popped to get a better look at the terrain. The Viet Cong were quick, like ghosts fading into the trees. They didn't stick around for long, and as suddenly as it started, the gunfire stopped. We didn't know if we'd scared them off or if they were regrouping, so we stayed in position, rifles trained on the darkness. My hands were shaking. No matter how much training you've had, that first real firefight throws you off. Your brain's screaming at you to run, but your body just stays frozen, locked in survival mode. When it seemed like the coast was clear, the lieutenant gave the signal to move forward. We found one of their guys lying in the dirt, an AK-47 still clutched in his hands. He couldn't have been older than me, maybe younger. That hit me hard. I'd grown up thinking soldiers were these hardened older guys, but this kid looked like he should have been in high school, not carrying a rifle through the jungle. Tex crouched down and checked the crate they'd been carrying. It was filled with rice, medical supplies, and a bunch of maps marked with routes and symbols we didn't recognize. Samuels ordered Tex to call it in while Ramirez and I kept watch. The rest of the squad started securing the area, but we didn't let our guard down. The Viet Cong rarely moved in such small groups, and something about it didn't sit right with me. As Tex was on the radio, we heard it, a faint rustling sound, followed by a low, rhythmic clicking noise. Ramirez grabbed my arm and motioned for me to stay still. The clicking grew louder, and that's when it hit me. They'd rigged claymore mines around us. We were in a trap. Everyone freeze! Ramirez hissed, barely loud enough to hear. Don't move. They got us surrounded. My stomach dropped. I could feel the sweat dripping down my back as I scanned the ground, trying to spot the mines. The jungle was so dense that it was almost impossible to see anything in the underbrush. The clicking noise stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I could tell everyone was holding their breath. Samuels made the call. Dugan, cut the lights. Everyone move low and slow. We're pulling back. I couldn't believe it. My heart was hammering so loud, I thought for sure the enemy would hear it. We started inching backward one step at a time. My eyes darted from the ground to the trees and back again, expecting an explosion at any second. Harris was just ahead of me, his rifle up and ready, when his boot snagged on a tripwire. The explosion wasn't as loud as I expected, but it was devastating. The claymore sent out a spray of shrapnel that ripped through the air like a swarm of angry bees. Harris went down immediately, screaming as he clutched his leg. Blood poured through his fingers, pooling on the ground beneath him. Before we could react, gunfire erupted from the jungle again. The Viet Cong had been waiting for us to trigger the trap. They had perfect cover, and we were sitting ducks. Ramirez and I dropped to the ground, crawling toward Harris as bullets zipped overhead. "Carter, cover me!" Ramirez yelled. I raised my M16 and fired blindly into the trees, trying to keep the enemy's heads down while Ramirez dragged Harris back toward the squad. The lieutenant was shouting orders, but everything was so chaotic I couldn't make out what he was saying. Then I felt it, a sharp, burning pain in my side. I looked down and saw blood seeping through my shirt. I'd been hit. It wasn't deep, but it was enough to knock the wind out of me. I pressed my hand against the wound and kept firing, refusing to let the pain slow me down. Tex managed to get a call out for backup, and within minutes, we heard the distant roar of Huey helicopters. The sound was like music to my ears. The gunships came in low, their rotors chopping through the air as they lit up the jungle with their machine guns. The Viet Cong didn't stand a chance against that kind of firepower. They scattered, melting back into the jungle as quickly as they'd appeared. The Hueys landed in a small clearing, and medics rushed out to grab Harris. He was pale and shaking, but he was alive. They loaded him onto a stretcher, along with a few others who'd taken hits. The rest of us piled into the helicopters, exhausted and shaken, but grateful to be alive. As we lifted off, I looked down at the jungle below. It looked peaceful from up there, almost beautiful, but I knew better. That place was alive, and it wanted to kill us. The ride back to base was silent. No one said a word, not even Tex, who usually had some joke to lighten the mood. Harris was on the stretcher in the corner of the Huey, his leg wrapped in a bloody bandage. The medics had given him a shot of morphine, so he wasn't screaming anymore, but the look on his face, dazed and pale, stuck with me. When we landed, the medics rushed Harris and the others to the field hospital. The rest of us headed to debrief. Samuels gave the rundown while we cleaned our rifles and tried to shake off the adrenaline. The crate we recovered had been loaded onto another chopper, heading back to HQ for analysis. Samuels seemed calm, but you could tell the firefight had rattled him. It rattled all of us. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flash of the claymore, heard Harris's screams, and felt the sting of the bullet that grazed me. I lay there on my cot, staring at the tin roof of our barracks, wondering how I was going to make it through the rest of my tour. I was just a kid, barely old enough to buy a beer back home. And here I was in the middle of a war that didn't make any sense to me. The next morning, we got our orders. We were heading back out. The intel team had reviewed the maps we'd recovered and determined they showed a network of supply routes connecting villages in the area. One of the routes led to a spot deep in the jungle where the Viet Cong were suspected of storing weapons and supplies. Our mission was to locate the cache and destroy it. We loaded up and set out just after dawn. The jungle felt different this time, quieter, heavier. I don't know if it was the weight of what had happened the night before or just my nerves playing tricks on me, but every shadow felt like a threat. We moved slowly, our rifles at the ready, eyes scanning for tripwires or anything else that looked out of place. After a few hours, we reached a clearing where the jungle opened up to reveal a small river. The water was murky and brown, and the air smelled like rotting vegetation. Ramirez suggested we take a short break, so we crouched by the riverbank, filling our canteens and trying to catch our breath. That's when I noticed something odd. On the far side of the river, hidden behind a cluster of bushes, was a wooden pole sticking out of the ground. Tied to the pole was a red flag with a gold star, the symbol of the Viet Cong. "Looks like we found their backyard," Tex muttered, his voice low. Samuels ordered us to cross the river and investigate. The water was waist-deep and slow-moving, but it still made me uneasy. You couldn't see more than a few inches below the surface, and I kept imagining some snake or trap waiting to grab us. We reached the other side and fanned out, moving cautiously through the underbrush. The jungle was thick here, the kind of thick where the trees block out the sunlight, leaving everything in a perpetual state of twilight. We could hear the faint hum of insects and the occasional bird call, but otherwise it was eerily quiet. Then we found it, a small, camouflage bunker hidden beneath a canopy of vines and branches. It looked abandoned at first, but as we got closer, we saw fresh footprints in the dirt around the entrance. Samuel signaled for us to hold our position while he and Ramirez moved in to check it out. The rest of us stayed back, covering them with our rifles. I kept my finger on the trigger, my eyes darting between the bunker and the trees around us. My heart was racing. Every instinct in my body was screaming that something wasn't right. Samuels and Ramirez disappeared into the bunker. A minute passed. Then two. I could feel the tension building, every second stretching out like an eternity. Finally, Samuels reappeared, motioning for us to join him. Inside, the air was damp and stale, smelling of earth and sweat. The bunker wasn't large, just a single room with a dirt floor and wooden walls reinforced with sandbags. In the corner was a stack of wooden crates marked with faded Russian lettering. Ramirez pried one open with his bayonet, revealing a stash of AK-47s and boxes of ammunition. Another crate held grenades, and a third was filled with bags of rice and cans of food. It was clear we'd found a major supply point. "Tex, get on the radio," Samuel said. "We'll mark this for air support. They'll take care of it." As Tex radioed in our position, I wandered to the back of the bunker, where I spotted a small, tattered notebook lying on the ground. I picked it up and flipped through the pages, which were filled with handwritten notes in Vietnamese. Ramirez came over and took a look. "Could be something important," he said. "Looks like coordinates or orders." We bagged the notebook along with a few other documents we found scattered around. Once Tex confirmed the airstrike was on its way, we started to pull back. That's when we heard it, a rustling noise, faint but unmistakable, coming from the trees outside the bunker. "Movement," Dugan hissed, raising his rifle. We froze, listening. The rustling grew louder, closer. My palms were sweating as I gripped my M16, aiming it toward the bunker's entrance. Then, out of nowhere, a burst of gunfire erupted, the sound deafening in the confined space. The Viet Cong were coming, and they knew exactly where we were. The gunfire was immediate and overwhelming, echoing through the dense jungle like thunder. Bullets tore into the bunker's wooden walls, spraying dirt and splinters everywhere. We all hit the ground, hugging the floor as the Viet Cong poured fire into the entrance. "Return fire! Return fire!" Samuels yelled, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Ramirez and I scrambled to the firing slots on the bunker walls, squeezing off bursts from our M16s. Tex grabbed the radio and called for an emergency update to the airstrike. "We need support now. We're pinned down at the target's site." Tex shouted into the receiver, his voice strained. "They're everywhere." Dugan hollered from his position by the entrance. He had his M16 propped against a sandbag, firing into the jungle with a desperation I felt in my bones. The Viet Cong weren't just attacking, they were swarming. Shadows moved between the trees, too fast to aim at. They had us surrounded. A grenade exploded outside, shaking the bunker and filling it with dust and smoke. My ears were ringing, but I forced myself to focus, firing at any movement I could see. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. Ramirez, crouched beside me, shouted over the noise. "Carter, watch the left side. They're flanking." I swung my rifle toward the left opening just as a figure emerged from the foliage. The man raised an AK-47, but I fired first, the sharp crack of my M16 drowning out everything else for a moment. The Viet Cong soldier dropped, disappearing into the bushes. "Reloading," I called out, fumbling with a fresh magazine. My hands were shaking so badly, it took me 2 tries to slam it into place. Tex was still on the radio, shouting coordinates and updates. "ETA on air support is 5 minutes, he yelled to Samuels. 5 minutes might as well be 5 hours, Ramirez muttered, ducking as another burst of gunfire ripped through the bunker. We were running low on ammo. Every shot had to count, but the enemy wasn't letting up. The sound of AK-47 fire was constant, mixed with the occasional whoosh of grenades. My shoulder ached from the recoil of my rifle, and my arms felt like lead. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The distinct clicking sound of another claymore being armed. The Viet Cong weren't just attacking. They were setting up traps to cut off our escape. "Lieutenant, they're rigging the area," I shouted. Samuels nodded grimly. "Hold the line. Air support's almost here." The tension was unbearable. Every second felt like an eternity. Dugan screamed as a round caught him in the shoulder, and Ramirez dragged him to cover while I kept firing. The bunker was turning into a death trap, and we all knew it. Finally, the distant thump of rotor blades broke through the chaos. The Hueys were coming. I've never felt such a mix of relief and fear in my life. Relief because help was on the way. Fear because I knew they'd have to come in hot, and we'd need to hold out a little longer. The gunships arrived in a blur of noise and fury. They came in low, their door gunners opening up with M60 machine guns that tore through the jungle. The sound was deafening, a rapid, relentless clatter that drowned out everything else. The Viet Cong shifted their fire toward the helicopters, giving us a brief moment to regroup. "Move! Now!" Samuels ordered. We grabbed what we could, our rifles, the capture documents, and whatever ammo we had left, and bolted from the bunker. The Hueys circled overhead, their guns blazing as we sprinted toward the river. The jungle around us was a nightmare of smoke, fire, and falling debris. Ramirez helped Dugan limp along while Tex and I covered the rear. I fired blindly into the jungle, not aiming at anything specific, but hoping to keep the enemy off our backs. My chest burned with every breath, and my legs felt like they were made of concrete, but I didn't stop. We reached the river and plunged in without hesitation. The water was cold and shocking against my skin, but it didn't slow me down. We pushed through, dragging ourselves onto the opposite bank just as the first napalm strike hit. The explosion was massive, a wave of heat and sound that rolled over us like a freight train. I turned back to see the jungle erupt in flames, the air filled with black smoke and the sharp, chemical smell of burning vegetation. The Viet Cong positions were obliterated, the inferno consuming everything in its path. We didn't stop to celebrate. The Hueys landed in the clearing where we'd first crossed the river, their rotors kicking up dust and debris. Medics rushed out to grab Dugan, who was pale and barely conscious. The rest of us climbed aboard, collapsing into the seats as the helicopters lifted off. I looked down at the burning jungle as we ascended, the fires spreading in waves. It was a hellish sight, one I'll never forget. The mission was a success. We destroyed the supply cache and taken out a significant enemy force, but it didn't feel like a victory. As we flew back to base, no one spoke. We were too tired, too shaken. The war had a way of stripping you down to nothing, leaving you with just the raw, ugly truth of survival. I leaned back against the wall of the Huey, my rifle resting on my lap. My side throbbed where the bullet had grazed me, but I didn't care. I was alive, and for now, that was enough. We didn't stay at base long after that mission. We patched ourselves up, got resupplied, and by the next morning, we were back out on patrol. That's the thing about war. It doesn't care if you're hurt, tired, or scared. You just keep going, whether you're ready or not. The days blurred together, a mix of jungle, sweat, and endless waiting. After the attack near the river, we knew the Viet Cong were hunting us, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every patrol felt like a game of Russian roulette, and we all knew it. One wrong move, and that could be it. We were working with a new set of intel, but it didn't feel any different than before. Our command had gotten a tip about a Viet Cong stronghold hidden deep in the jungle, so we were tasked with taking it out. The mission seemed straightforward enough. Find the enemy, destroy the camp, and get back to base. But deep down, I had a sinking feeling it wouldn't be that simple. The terrain was tougher than usual. We were moving through a section of jungle known for its dense underbrush and steep hills. The heat was unbearable, and the constant buzz of mosquitoes gnawed at you, making it feel like the jungle was alive and feeding off you. Even our gear felt heavier with each step, and it wasn't just the physical weight, it was the mental weight too. Everyone was on edge, but we didn't talk about it. In Vietnam, silence was often louder than any conversation. We'd been trekking for hours when we reached a small, cleared-out area. It was quiet, too quiet. There was no sound of birds or insects, and for a moment, I thought maybe we'd reached a dead zone in the jungle. But that wasn't the case. Something was off. Tex was the first to notice it. He had a way of sensing things, especially when it came to danger. "Sergeant, something's wrong. This doesn't feel right." His voice was low, like he was trying not to draw attention to himself. But there was no mistaking the tension in his words. I looked around, squinting through the thick canopy above us. There was no movement in the trees, no signs of life anywhere. But that's when I noticed it. The ground was disturbed. Small, fresh footprints were scattered around the area, leading off in multiple directions. Some of them were too small to be American, and others had the distinct look of Viet Cong foot soldiers. "Samuels, look at this," I said, kneeling down to get a better look. He crouched beside me, studying the tracks. "They've been here recently," he muttered, pulling out a map. "We need to keep moving but stay alert. If they're nearby, we don't want to walk into their traps." We moved on, keeping low and slow. The trees here were tall, their roots winding up through the ground like the fingers of some giant creature. As we moved deeper into the jungle, the silence grew even more intense. Every step felt like it could trigger a bomb or set off a firefight. My muscles were sore from the constant tension, but I forced myself to keep moving. By late afternoon, we reached the edge of a ravine. The steep cliffs dropped off sharply, and below, we could see the faint outline of a camp. There were a few small structures made from bamboo, their roofs covered with leaves and thatch. We could hear voices, but they were muffled, and it wasn't clear how many people were down there. Samuels motioned for us to move into position. The plan was to get the drop on them, take out any sentries, get in, destroy the supplies, and get out. But as we moved closer, the ground beneath us seemed to shift. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of a twig snapping. My heart skipped a beat. I whipped my head around, scanning the area. My rifle was raised before I even realized it, my eyes darting across the trees. There, just a shadow, but enough to make me hold my breath. The sound came again, closer this time. Then another. "Ambush!" I shouted. Before I could finish the word, gunfire erupted from all directions. The sound of bullets slicing through the air was deafening, and for a moment, I thought I was hearing my own heartbeat in the chaos. I hit the ground and returned fire, blindly spraying my M16 toward the sounds of movement in the trees. But it wasn't enough. They were everywhere. Viet Cong soldiers, emerging from behind trees, from beneath the roots of giant ferns, from the ravine itself. It was as if they'd been waiting for us, setting us up from the moment we stepped into their territory. "Get to cover! Now!" Samuel shouted, pulling me back toward a large tree trunk. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. Ramirez and I dove behind the trunk, our rifles firing in short bursts to keep the enemy pinned down. The enemy was relentless. They knew the terrain better than we did, and their movement was fluid, like water through the rocks. I could barely see them, only the occasional flash of an AK-47 or the outline of a soldier moving through the underbrush. Then I heard Dugan shout, his voice laced with panic. "They got a damn machine gun!" I turned just in time to see a Viet Cong gunner set up a heavy MG-42 near the edge of the ravine. The gun started firing in a rapid staccato, sending rounds ricocheting off the trees around us. We were trapped. Tex shouted over the noise. "We need to flank them. Move around the left side." We didn't have much of a choice. If we stayed where we were, we'd get pinned down for good. Samuels gave the order, and we scrambled to move. But as we shifted to the left, I saw something I'll never forget. A Viet Cong soldier, no older than I was, stepped out from behind a tree, his rifle aimed directly at me. For a second, time seemed to slow down. I saw his eyes, wild with fear or maybe adrenaline, maybe both. We both raised our weapons at the same time, but I fired first. He fell, but I didn't feel relieved. I didn't feel anything at all. We kept moving, the jungle alive with the sound of gunfire, the heat, the sweat, the fear. It was all the same. We had to keep moving. There was no other option. We had no air support this time, no backup. The enemy was closing in from all sides, and the only thing that mattered now was survival. I could feel the sweat soaking my uniform, sticking to my skin. The constant gunfire was deafening, but it wasn't the sound of the rifles that had me rattled. It was the silence in between. The moments when everything went still, and you could feel the tension in the air, like the jungle itself was holding its breath. That silence meant the enemy was regrouping, preparing for their next move. We moved as fast as we could, sticking to the trees for cover and trying to keep our heads down. Samuels led us through the dense brush, his voice low but urgent. "We need to make it to the ravine. It's the only way out." But the ravine was getting further away. The enemy wasn't making it easy for us. They were everywhere, hidden in the trees, in the shadows of the cliff edges. The heavy fire from that machine gun made it nearly impossible to move without being spotted. I was exhausted, my body aching from the constant strain. But there was something else gnawing at me, something that made the fatigue worse. It was the feeling that we were losing, that we'd already lost too much, and that there was no way to get it back. We pushed on, my fingers numb from holding my rifle. I tried to focus on the task, but everything felt like a blur. My vision was swimming, and every sound seemed magnified. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and shallow, and the pounding of my heart. Then, as if it had been waiting for the right moment, the machine gun opened up again, its fire cutting through the jungle with terrifying precision. It was too much. We needed to take it out, or we were done. "Samuels," I shouted, my voice cracking. "We need to hit that gun. If we don't, we're not getting out of here." He turned, his face set in a grim line. "I know, Carter. I know." He looked around quickly, scanning the area for a plan. I could see the same fear in his eyes that I felt in my gut, but there was no time for fear. He nodded, his decision made. "Ramirez, you and Dugan move to the right flank. Tex with me. We're going left. Carter, cover us." I didn't hesitate. I crouched behind a tree and opened fire, trying to suppress the enemy's gunfire. Each shot felt like it might be the last, but I didn't think about that. I just kept firing, hoping to give my teammates a chance. The seconds felt like hours. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were moving into position. I could hear their movements, the rustle of leaves, and the soft thud of boots against the earth. I focused on the enemy positions in front of me, trying to keep their heads down long enough for our flankers to get into place. Then, the world exploded in a sudden burst of sound. A grenade went off somewhere to the left, followed by the roar of a heavy weapon. The machine gun fire stopped for a brief moment, and that's when Samuels and Tex made their move. They dashed forward, using the cover of the explosion to rush the gunner's position. I kept firing, my arms burning with the effort. My hands were slick with sweat, and my vision was beginning to blur again, but I couldn't stop. Then, the crack of gunfire stopped. The jungle was eerily quiet for a moment, and then I heard Samuel's voice. "It's down! It's down! Move up!" We were still in danger, but we had a chance now. We pushed forward, running as fast as we could toward the ravine. It felt like the longest sprint of my life, but I didn't stop. The enemy was in disarray, trying to reorganize, but they weren't ready for us. We reached the edge of the ravine, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. For the first time in what felt like forever, we had the high ground. We quickly found cover, taking a moment to catch our breath. The worst of the fight was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I glanced around, I saw that Dugan was still holding his shoulder, grimacing with pain. Ramirez was checking his rifle, and Tex had already set up a perimeter. Samuels walked up to me, his face haggard, but there was something in his eyes, something that told me he was still processing the battle we'd just been through. "We're not out yet," he said quietly, though there was a note of something in his voice I couldn't quite place. I nodded. I knew what he meant. The Viet Cong were relentless. They might be regrouping, but they wouldn't let us go that easily. The next few hours felt like a blur. We waited in silence, watching the jungle below for any sign of movement. The night came, and with it, the cold. My teeth chattered as I hugged my knees to my chest, trying to keep warm, but all I could think about was how close we'd come to losing it all. At some point, I drifted off, exhaustion taking over. When I woke, the sun was just rising, and the jungle was quiet. Too quiet. I sat up, alert now, scanning the surroundings. It was hard to tell how much time had passed, but I felt a sense of calm in the air. We weren't out of danger yet, but we had made it through the worst of it. I knew we'd have to get out of there soon. But for now, there was a brief moment of peace. I looked at my comrades, each one of them a reminder of everything we'd been through together. The ghosts of the jungle hadn't let us go, but we were still standing. And that, in a war like this, was enough.